The moment the professor laughed, the entire hall decided the little girl would fail. The words weren't spoken out loud, but they hung in the air just the same, woven into every sideways glance, every raised eyebrow, every quiet smile hidden behind polished programs. The grand recital hall at the New England Conservatory shimmered beneath warm golden chandeliers, their reflections dancing across the glossy black surface of a 9-foot Steinway concert grand. Rows of velvet seats stretched toward the back of the room, filled with proud parents, music instructors, donors, and students dressed in tailored suits and elegant dresses. The annual Young Virtuosos Showcase was one of the most prestigious youth piano events in the country. Children from elite academies flew in from New York, Chicago, Los Angeles, and Boston to compete for scholarships that could change their futures. Every performer that afternoon carried a resume thicker than most adults. Every performer except one. 11-year-old Amara Johnson stood quietly near the edge of the stage. Her navy blue dress was simple. Her shoes had been polished carefully that morning until they reflected the light. She held her music folder against her chest, though she knew she wouldn't need it. Across the room, whispers drifted through the audience. Some wondered if she was in the right place. Others assumed she was waiting for someone. A few looked genuinely confused when they realized she was one of the finalists. Professor Richard Whitmore noticed the same thing. The silver-haired piano legend sat behind the judge's table with his arms crossed. His reputation stretched across decades. He had trained concert performers, advised orchestras, and published books that universities used around the world. When he spoke, young musicians listened. When he criticized, careers often changed direction. His eyes settled on Amara for a moment longer than necessary. Then a faint smirk appeared at the corner of his mouth. The previous contestant had just completed a demanding Chopin etude to enthusiastic applause. The audience was still clapping when Whitmore leaned toward the microphone. Next contestant, he announced. Amara stepped forward. The applause faded. The room grew still. Whitmore glanced at her application sheet. His expression barely changed. Amara Johnson, he read. 11 years old. A few people shifted in their seats. Amara nodded politely. Yes, sir. Whitmore looked over his glasses. Tell me, Amara, what piece have you prepared today? Beethoven's Sonata No. 23, Appassionata, first movement. A ripple of surprise moved through the room. Several audience members exchanged skeptical looks. Whitmore chuckled softly. Not loudly, not cruelly, just enough for everyone to hear. That's ambitious. More smiles appeared around the hall. Amara remained still. I've practiced it, sir. Whitmore leaned back in his chair. Well, he paused. Play something difficult. The smirk widened. Laughter flickered through parts of the audience. Not everyone joined in, but enough. Enough for Amara to hear it. Enough for every camera recording the event to capture the moment forever. For a second, nobody moved. The silence that followed felt heavier than the laughter itself. Whitmore folded his hands together. Certain he had made his point. Certain the room agreed with him. Certain the little girl standing under the stage lights had reached the limit of what she could possibly understand. But Amara Johnson didn't argue. She didn't defend herself. She didn't lower her eyes. Instead, she turned calmly toward the Steinway. Then she walked across the stage with quiet confidence, sat down on the piano bench, and gently placed her hands above the keys while an entire hall watched, waiting to discover whether the professor had just exposed a child's impossible dream or made the biggest mistake of his career. Amara's fingers hovered above the keys, but her mind was nowhere inside the grand recital hall. For a brief moment, she was back in the small brick church on Maple Street, nearly 60 miles away. The old upright piano sat in the corner beside a stained glass window that glowed amber every Sunday afternoon. Several of its keys were chipped. 2 notes stuck whenever the weather turned humid. The sustained pedal squeaked loudly enough to make people smile during quiet hymns. Yet to Amara, it had always sounded beautiful. It was the first piano she had ever touched. The first place where music felt less like sound and more like a language. 3 years earlier, after her father passed away from a sudden illness, life had become a series of careful calculations. Her mother, Danielle Johnson, worked long shifts at a nursing home during the day and cleaned office buildings several nights each week. Every dollar had a purpose before it even arrived. New clothes were planned months ahead. Broken appliances stayed broken until absolutely necessary. Piano lessons were never part of the budget, not because her mother did not believe in her talent, but because survival came first. So Amara learned differently. She borrowed music books from the public library. She watched recordings on an aging laptop that sometimes needed 10 minutes just to start. She copied fingering patterns into notebooks and practiced on cardboard drawings of piano keys whenever the church was closed. While other children attended master classes and summer academies, Amara spent afternoons studying worn pages under fluorescent library lights. The librarians knew her by name. The church custodian kept a spare key because he knew she would ask to practice after school. Over time, people began noticing something unusual. She was not simply memorizing music. She seemed to understand it. At 11 years old, she could describe the emotion behind a phrase, explain why a composer delayed a resolution, or recognize subtle changes between performances recorded decades apart. Reverend Collins often found her sitting alone at the piano long after choir practice ended. He would listen quietly from the back pews as melodies drifted through the empty sanctuary. Sometimes she played Beethoven, sometimes Chopin, sometimes pieces she created herself. Every note carried the same sincerity. She never played to impress anyone because there was nobody there to impress. She played because the music made sense of things she could not explain. The scholarship competition had not even been her idea. One evening, Reverend Collins overheard a visiting music teacher listening outside the church doors. The woman stood frozen for nearly 10 minutes before finally stepping inside. When Amara finished playing, the teacher asked where she studied. The answer left her speechless. A few weeks later, application forms arrived in the mail. Then came recommendation letters. Then an invitation. Now, surrounded by polished marble, expensive suits, and families who had spent years preparing for this exact moment, Amara knew she looked different. She knew some people saw her simple dress before they saw her talent. She knew others had already decided who belonged on this stage and who did not. Yet none of those thoughts showed on her face. The hall remained silent. The judges waited. Professor Whitmore watched from behind folded hands, confident in his assumptions. Across the audience, people leaned forward in anticipation. They expected nerves. They expected hesitation. They expected a mistake. Instead, Amara took one slow breath, settled her shoulders, and let her hands rest gently on the ivory keys as though she had finally arrived exactly where she belonged. From his seat behind the judges' table, Professor Richard Whitmore watched the small figure at the piano with growing amusement. He had spent more than 40 years in the world of classical music, and experience had taught him that confidence often arrived long before ability. Every year he met students who believed passion alone could overcome technique. Every year reality proved otherwise. Around him sat distinguished musicians, university faculty members, and competition sponsors. Their expressions ranged from curiosity to polite concern. Nobody said anything, but Whitmore recognized the same silent question in many of their eyes. How had this girl made it this far? He glanced once more at the application folder resting beside his score sheets. The information was surprisingly thin. No prestigious academy. No private conservatory. No famous instructors. No competition victories worth mentioning. The recommendation letters had been passionate, but unconventional. A church pastor. A public librarian. A retired music teacher. Not exactly the names that normally appeared on finalists' applications. Whitmore tapped a pen, lightly against the table. Something about the entire situation irritated him. Excellence, in his view, required discipline, structure, and years of expert guidance. Talent was only the beginning. The finest musicians in the world did not emerge from nowhere. They were shaped carefully, deliberately, over time. Yet here sat a little girl from a small town, surrounded by students whose families had invested tens of thousands of dollars into their training. To Whitmore, it felt less like opportunity and more like sentimentality. Across the hall, proud parents sat beside children who had practiced 6 hours a day for years. Some of them had relocated across the country for access to elite teachers. Others had postponed vacations, adjusted careers, and reorganized entire lives around musical development. The competition represented sacrifice. Standards mattered. Whitmore believed that deeply. One of the judges beside him leaned closer. "She seems calm," the woman whispered. Whitmore gave a faint shrug. Children often do before they understand what they are attempting. The woman did not respond. Her gaze returned to Amara. Meanwhile, several rows back, Danielle Johnson sat quietly near the aisle. She wore her only formal jacket, purchased secondhand 3 years earlier. Her hands remained clasped tightly in her lap. She could feel her heartbeat in her fingertips. Everything about the room felt larger than life. The chandeliers, the polished stage, the distinguished guests. She knew many people saw differences between her daughter and the other finalists. She had noticed the looks, the assumptions, the subtle dismissals. But she also remembered nights when she returned home after midnight to find Amara still awake, headphones on, studying sheet music beneath a small desk lamp. She remembered weekends spent practicing inside an empty church while rain tapped softly against stained glass windows. She remembered determination stronger than circumstances. Back on stage, Amara adjusted the piano bench slightly. The movement was small, almost unnoticeable, yet it revealed something many people missed. She was not intimidated. She was preparing. Professor Whitmore noticed the adjustment and narrowed his eyes. There was an unexpected familiarity in her posture, a certain economy of movement. No wasted energy, no unnecessary gestures. For a brief second, the image stirred a distant memory he could not quite place. Then the thought vanished as quickly as it arrived. He folded his arms again and settled deeper into his chair. Whatever curiosity he felt disappeared beneath certainty. In his mind, the outcome had already been decided. The audience waited. The judges waited. The hall seemed to hold its breath. And in the silence before the first note, Richard Whitmore remained completely unaware that the assumptions he had carried for decades were only moments away from being challenged. The first note arrived so softly that several people in the audience almost missed it. It floated through the hall like a single drop of water falling into a still lake. Then another followed. Then another. Within seconds, the enormous room that had felt filled with judgment became filled with music instead. Amara's hands moved with quiet precision across the keyboard. There was nothing theatrical about her performance. No exaggerated gestures. No dramatic expressions. Every movement seemed natural, as though the music already existed somewhere inside her, and she was simply allowing everyone else to hear it. Professor Whitmore sat upright almost immediately. The change was subtle, but noticeable. His arms unfolded. His eyes narrowed. Beethoven's demanding passages began to unfold beneath Amara's fingertips with remarkable clarity. The difficult runs remained clean. The phrasing remained controlled. Most surprising of all was the maturity behind the interpretation. This was not a child attempting to imitate recordings she had studied. It felt personal, thoughtful, honest. Around the hall, whispers disappeared. Programs stopped rustling. Phones lowered. One by one, attention shifted completely toward the stage. A teenage competitor sitting in the second row stared openly in disbelief. His own performance earlier had required years of professional coaching. Yet the girl on stage was producing something different. Something impossible to measure through technique alone. Professor Whitmore glanced briefly at the score in front of him. Then back to Amara. Then back to the score again. He searched instinctively for mistakes. Timing errors. Inconsistent articulation. Missed voicing. Something. Anything. Instead, he found himself listening. Truly listening. That realization irritated him more than he wanted to admit. Beside him, another judge leaned forward. "Goodness," she whispered. No one responded. Across the hall, Danielle Johnson felt tears gathering unexpectedly in her eyes. Not because Amara was proving anyone wrong. Not because of scholarships or recognition. But because she recognized the sound. She had heard it late at night through thin apartment walls. She had heard it during weekends at the church. She had heard it during moments when her daughter thought nobody was paying attention. This was the same music. The same heart. Only now the entire room could hear it too. The sonata continued building in intensity. Notes rose and fell like waves beneath moonlight. Every phrase carried purpose. Every silence carried meaning. Even people with little knowledge of classical music sensed that something unusual was happening. They could feel it in the atmosphere. The laughter from earlier seemed impossible now, as though it belonged to another afternoon entirely. Professor Whitmore shifted in his chair. A strange sensation tugged at the edge of his memory. The way Amara shaped a melodic line. The way she delayed a resolution by the smallest fraction of a second. The way she balanced strength with restraint. He had heard something similar before. Many years ago. Somewhere. The feeling lingered just beyond reach. Then Amara entered one of the most demanding passages in the movement. Several audience members held their breath. The section challenged even advanced performers. Fingers had to move with confidence and precision. A single mistake could disrupt the entire flow. Yet Amara moved through it effortlessly. Not hurried, not cautious, certain. The room seemed frozen. Professor Whitmore slowly lowered the pen in his hand. For the first time that afternoon, uncertainty crept into his thoughts. The assumptions that had felt so solid only minutes earlier no longer fit what he was seeing. And as the music continued to rise through the hall, he found himself asking a question he never expected to ask. Who exactly is this child? The final measures of the movement echoed through the hall before dissolving into silence. No one moved. No one reached for a program. No one whispered. The last note seemed to linger somewhere above the audience, suspended beneath the chandeliers. Amara slowly lifted her hands from the keys and rested them in her lap. Her expression remained calm, almost thoughtful, as though she had simply finished a conversation rather than a performance. Several seconds passed, then 10, then 15. The silence grew so complete that the faint hum of the building's ventilation system became noticeable. Professor Whitmore stared at the stage. He had spent decades evaluating musicians, and he knew the difference between technical skill and artistic understanding. What he had just witnessed belonged to the second category. That realization unsettled him more than he cared to admit. Beside him, one of the judges quietly removed her glasses and wiped away tears gathering at the corners of her eyes. Another judge shook his head in disbelief. 11 years old, he murmured. That cannot be taught. Whitmore did not answer. His gaze remained fixed on Amara. Something continued pulling at his memory. Not merely her playing. Not merely her phrasing. Something deeper. Familiar. Then his eyes drifted toward the application folder again. Johnson. The name lingered in his thoughts. Johnson. He had seen that name before. Years ago. Somewhere important. The realization remained frustratingly out of reach. Across the audience, people finally began breathing again. A few audience members exchanged stunned looks. Others simply sat frozen in their seats. The assumptions that had filled the room earlier had vanished without a trace. Nobody was thinking about scholarships anymore. Nobody was thinking about social status, private academies, or expensive training programs. They were thinking about the music. Danielle Johnson pressed a trembling hand against her chest. She recognized the moment before anyone else did. Not because she understood competitions. Not because she understood judges. Because she knew her daughter. She knew that Amara had just shown the world exactly who she was. Then something unexpected happened. Instead of signaling for applause, Professor Whitmore leaned forward. The movement immediately drew attention from the entire judges' table. He opened the application folder once more and carefully turned several pages. His eyes moved faster with each line he read. Suddenly he stopped. A recommendation letter had slipped partially free from the folder. The signature at the bottom caught his attention. Not the pastor. Not the librarian. Another page hidden behind them. His face changed. The color drained slightly from his expression. 20 years earlier, there had been a young pianist named Marcus Johnson. Brilliant. Fearless. Extraordinary. A student many believed would transform the classical music world. Whitmore remembered him clearly now. He also remembered the opportunity that never came. The audition. The disagreement. The decision that altered a promising career before it could truly begin. Slowly, Whitmore lifted his eyes toward the girl sitting at the piano. For the first time all afternoon, he was no longer looking at a contestant. He was looking at a ghost from his own past. And the question forming in his mind suddenly felt impossible to ignore. Was Amara Johnson merely talented, or was she the daughter of the one musician he had never been able to forget? The hall remained silent, but it was no longer the silence of doubt. It was the silence that follows a discovery. Amara sat patiently on the piano bench while judges finalized their notes. She did not know what had changed inside Professor Whitmore. She only noticed that the confidence he carried earlier seemed different now. Less certain, more reflective. The afternoon sunlight filtered through the tall windows near the back of the recital hall, painting long bands of gold across the polished floor. Dust drifted slowly through the light like tiny floating stars. For a brief moment, the competition seemed to disappear. The pressure faded. The audience faded. Even the scholarship felt distant. Amara's thoughts wandered to her father. She remembered the few stories her mother shared over the years. Marcus Johnson had loved music with his entire heart. According to Danielle, there was never a room he entered without noticing a piano. He could hear patterns in ordinary sounds. The rhythm of train tracks, the hum of air conditioners, rain tapping against windows. Everything became music to him. Amara had been very young when he passed away, and most of her memories existed through photographs and stories. Yet somehow she always felt connected to him whenever she played. Danielle often said that Marcus believed music was not about impressing people. It was about helping people feel understood. Those words had guided Amara every time she touched a keyboard. Across the judge's table, Professor Whitmore carefully reread the recommendation letter he had discovered. The paper had yellowed slightly with age because it had originally been written years earlier and kept among Marcus Johnson's records. Reverend Collins had included a copy with Amara's application. At the bottom of the page sat Whitmore's own signature. The sight unsettled him. Memories he had not revisited in decades returned with uncomfortable clarity. He remembered Marcus arriving at a prestigious audition carrying borrowed sheet music and wearing a suit that had clearly seen better days. He remembered extraordinary talent. He also remembered allowing practical concerns and assumptions to influence decisions that should have been based solely on ability. At the time, he had convinced himself he was protecting standards. Looking back now, he was no longer certain. The realization sat heavily in his chest. One of the judges leaned toward him. "Richard, are you all right?" He nodded slowly. "I am beginning to realize that I may have been wrong about something for a very long time." The judge studied him, but asked no further questions. Nearby, audience members continued discussing the performance in hushed voices. Nobody was speaking about Amara as an underdog anymore. Nobody was questioning whether she belonged there. The conversation had changed entirely. People were discussing interpretation, artistry, and emotional depth. They were discussing her as a musician. The afternoon light continued to soften as the competition moved toward its conclusion. On stage, Amara folded her hands quietly in her lap and waited. She had no idea that the music she had just played was doing far more than impressing a room full of strangers. It was opening a door that had remained closed for more than 20 years, and on the other side waited a truth that neither she nor Professor Whitmore could avoid much longer. When the final contestant finished performing, the judges withdrew briefly to complete their evaluations. The audience remained seated, speaking in quiet voices beneath the warm glow of the chandeliers. Amara sat beside her mother near the front row, unaware that several members of the judging panel kept glancing in her direction. Across the room, Professor Whitmore stood alone near a window overlooking the city skyline. In his hands was the old recommendation letter. He had read it so many times during the past 20 minutes that he nearly knew every word by heart. Yet one sentence refused to leave his mind. Marcus Johnson possesses a rare ability to make people forget they are listening to technique and remember they are listening to truth. Richard Whitmore himself had written those words more than 2 decades earlier. The memory finally returned in full. Marcus had not merely been talented. He had been extraordinary. During a national audition program, dozens of candidates had competed for a prestigious fellowship. Marcus had delivered one of the finest performances Whitmore had ever heard from a young musician. But afterward, concerns had been raised behind closed doors. Questions about background. Questions about connections. Questions about whether someone from Marcus's circumstances could succeed within elite classical institutions. Whitmore had not started those conversations, but neither had he stopped them. In the end, he chose the safer candidate, the more conventional candidate. The fellowship changed that student's life. Marcus never received the opportunity. Standing by the window now, Whitmore felt a weight he had carried for years without fully acknowledging it. Suddenly, a voice interrupted his thoughts. "Professor." He turned to find Danielle Johnson standing nearby. She looked nervous but composed. Whitmore glanced toward Amara. "She is your daughter." Danielle nodded. "Yes." A long silence followed. Then Whitmore asked quietly, "Marcus Johnson was her father, was he not?" Danielle's expression softened with surprise. "You remember him?" Whitmore closed his eyes briefly. "I should have remembered much sooner." Danielle looked toward the stage where volunteers prepared for the awards ceremony. "He admired you once," she said gently. "He kept that letter his entire life." The words struck harder than any criticism ever could. Whitmore lowered his gaze. I did not give him the chance he deserved. Danielle studied him carefully. There was no anger in her expression, only honesty. No, you did not. The silence that followed felt heavier than anything spoken. Moments later, the audience was called to attention. Judges returned to their seats. Final rankings were about to be announced. Yet for Richard Whitmore, the competition no longer felt like the most important event in the room. Across the stage sat a young girl whose gift had reopened a chapter of his life he believed was long finished. And as he looked at Amara Johnson beneath the stage lights, he finally understood why her playing had sounded so familiar. It was not because she copied her father. It was because she carried the same rare quality Marcus once possessed, the ability to transform music into something deeply human. In that moment, Richard Whitmore realized that the greatest lesson of the day had not been about talent. It had been about the cost of underestimating someone before truly seeing them. The audience rose to attention as the master of ceremonies stepped onto the stage carrying the final results. The room felt different now. Earlier, people had arrived expecting a competition. Now many felt as though they had witnessed something far more meaningful. Names were announced. Scholarships were awarded. Applause echoed beneath the chandeliers. When the highest honor of the afternoon was finally revealed, Amara Johnson's name filled the hall. The applause that followed was immediate and overwhelming. Danielle covered her mouth with both hands as tears slipped down her cheeks. Amara looked stunned for only a moment before standing and walking toward the stage. She accepted the award with the same quiet grace she had shown all afternoon. No dramatic celebration, no triumphant gesture, just gratitude. Yet before the ceremony could continue, an unexpected movement drew everyone's attention. Professor Richard Whitmore slowly rose from his seat. The room fell silent almost instantly. People assumed he was about to offer formal remarks about the competition. Instead, he walked toward center stage and stopped beside Amara. For several seconds, he simply stood there looking at her. The confidence that had defined him earlier seemed replaced by something much more vulnerable. He turned toward the audience and reached for the microphone. "There is something I need to say." His voice carried through the hall with unusual softness. Every conversation stopped. Every eye focused on him. Whitmore took a slow breath. "Today I came here believing I could evaluate talent." He glanced toward Amara. "What I discovered instead is that talent is not always what needs evaluating." Confusion spread through parts of the audience. Whitmore continued, "Many years ago, I met a remarkable young musician named Marcus Johnson." Danielle's eyes widened. Amara looked toward her mother. The hall remained completely silent. "He possessed extraordinary ability," Whitmore said. "But when an important opportunity appeared, I allowed assumptions and expectations to influence my judgment. I convinced myself I was protecting standards. The truth is much simpler. I failed to see someone clearly." His words landed heavily across the room. Nobody moved. Nobody interrupted. "Today," Whitmore continued, "his daughter reminded me of that mistake." He turned fully toward Amara. "Not because she proved me wrong with anger. Not because she demanded recognition. But because she demonstrated excellence with humility, dignity, and grace." Amara stood quietly beside him, listening. Whitmore lowered his head. "Slightly. I owe you an apology. And I owe one to your father as well." The hall seemed frozen. For a man of his stature, the admission carried enormous weight. Yet what happened next surprised everyone even more. Amara stepped closer and looked up at him. There was no resentment in her expression. No bitterness. Only kindness. "My father always said music helps people become better," she said softly. "I think he would be happy you remembered him." Several audience members wiped away tears. Danielle closed her eyes briefly. Whitmore smiled for the first time all afternoon, though emotion softened the expression. In that moment, nobody saw a famous professor and a scholarship winner standing on stage. They saw something much rarer. A mistake acknowledged. A lesson learned. And a young girl whose quiet strength had succeeded where pride never could. Long after the ceremony ended, the recital hall began to empty. Rows of velvet seats slowly cleared as families gathered their belongings and stepped into the fading afternoon. Conversations drifted toward the exits, carrying excitement, congratulations, and plans for the future. Yet a quiet stillness remained beneath the chandeliers. Amara stood alone near the stage for a moment, holding the scholarship certificate carefully against her chest. The polished Steinway still sat beneath the warm lights, exactly where it had been hours earlier. Nothing about the piano had changed. The room had. Across the hall, Danielle watched her daughter with a smile that seemed brighter than any award. Years of sacrifice, long work shifts, and uncertain days suddenly felt lighter. Not because life would become easy, but because someone had finally seen what she had always known was there. Amara walked slowly toward the piano and rested her fingertips on the smooth black surface. The wood reflected the golden light above like calm water at sunset. For a few seconds, she simply stood there, remembering the small church piano back home, remembering the worn keys, remembering quiet afternoons when nobody was listening. Those moments felt very far away and very close at the same time. Near the front of the hall, Professor Whitmore remained, seated alone. Most of the judges had already left. The applause was gone. The speeches were over. Only silence remained. He watched Amara from a distance and thought about the strange way life sometimes offered second chances. Not to erase old mistakes, not to rewrite history, simply to recognize the truth that should have been recognized long ago. After a moment, he stood and walked toward the stage. His footsteps echoed softly across the polished floor. Amara noticed him approaching and smiled politely. Neither spoke immediately. Words suddenly seemed less important than they had earlier. Finally, Whitmore looked toward the piano. "Your father would be proud of you," he said quietly. Amara glanced at the keys and then back at him. "I hope so." The professor nodded. "I think he already is." For a moment, neither moved. Then Danielle called gently from across the room. Their ride home had arrived. Amara adjusted the strap of her bag and turned toward the exit. Before leaving, she looked back one final time. The grand piano stood beneath a pool of golden light. The stage that had once felt intimidating now felt peaceful. She smiled softly and walked away. Professor Whitmore remained where he was, watching until she disappeared through the doorway beside her mother. Outside, the evening sky stretched across the city in shades of amber and blue. Inside, the hall grew quiet. The last rays of sunlight touched the piano keys before slowly fading away. No applause remained. No speeches remained. Only the memory of a little girl who had walked onto a stage carrying nothing but talent, dignity, and kindness. And in the silence that followed, the lesson lingered longer than any note ever could. True greatness was never about being the most powerful person in the room. It was about helping others finally see what was there all along.